This is Marjorie from Chino, California, and you are listening to California Dreaming on the Orbital Jigsaw Network. Have a great day.
This episode of California Dreaming is brought to you by BLUBRRY. Creating a podcast isn't that simple. It's more than just recording yourself and uploading it. To really get your show to be everything you want it to be, you're gonna need a little more than that. You need easy, reliable hosting so your time can be spent creating your content. The most accurate download stats so you know if you're reaching the audience you're wanting to, and a web page that makes setting up totally easy on you and won't take up too much of your valuable time. And BLUBRRRY offers all of this and more for hosts and aspiring hosts alike. Simple media hosting, a fully integrated WordPress website with their PowerPress sites. So if you already have a podcast or you've always dreamed about starting one, head over to www.orbitaljigsaw.com/dream to sign up, and the first month is on us. The BLUBRRRY support team is available to walk you through the steps of migrating your show without losing any subscribers, or to help you get started in the process of launching your new show. With the first month for free, using promo code DREAM, you've got no more excuses. So, let's get started. I do want to take the time to thank everyone for continuing to support California Dreaming on social media by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as for those who have left reviews for the show on Apple Podcasts or whichever platforms you listen to the show on. By also spreading the word by recommending California Dreaming in listening groups, and of course, supporting us on Patreon as well. There are about 20 exclusive bonuses now available on Patreon, and for as little as $1 a month, you can gain access to all of those episodes. This week, I would like to thank Lisa D., Crystal P., Dee Dee J., Jessica B., Fran D., Brandy K., and Tasia M. for joining Patreon. And I would also like to thank Vicky with 2 eyes, Kelly M., and Connie L. for jumping up to the next level in your support. And if you would like to make a one-time donation to help support the production of this show, you can do so through PayPal by using our email, californiapod@gmail.com. Thank you once again for all your support. Dreamers, we are going to take a detour away from the usual crimes we typically discuss on our show here. Murder, sexual assault, contract killings, etc., etc. Instead, we're going to talk about bank robbery. Robbing a bank today isn't the same as robbing a bank 20, 30, 40 years ago, or even longer. A bank robber just isn't going to get away with it as easily as they used to. And this can pretty much be attributed to one thing: technology. In an article in the New York Post from a little more than a year ago discussed the modern day bank robbery and how it just isn't paying off the way it used to. Bank heists are being solved at an ever-increasing percentage rate, more than 80% of the time, and bank robbery attempts are declining overall, and all of it has to do with technology. The article stating, technology has allowed the banks to provide a variety of different defenses to bank robberies: motion sensors, surveillance cameras, silent teller alarms, window monitors that detect shattering glass, and exploding die packs and GPS tracking devices placed along with the stolen money are the bank's first line of defense. So, with all of the ways bank robberies can now be thwarted or solved easily, the question is raised: why are still people trying to rob banks nowadays? The article would point to anything from people finding themselves in a deep financial crisis to people struggling with substance abuse and drug addiction, both of whom are looking to pull off that one heist that's going to get them through. But people who think bank robbery is going to result in a quick and easy way to come into a windfall of cash are going to find, more often than not, these days they aren't going to come away with a big haul of cash, and even if they did, they aren't going to be able to go far with it. Tellers simply don't have the kinds of money in their drawers that bank robbers tend to think that they do. And if you do rob a bank, and your image is going to be splashed across the news, on TV, in the morning papers, and not to mention all over Facebook, Twitter. All the social media is going to be spreading the word. That old pass the note to the teller with the money demand just isn't going to fly anymore. In New Jersey, for example, 22-year-old Richard Nixon tried to rob 3 different banks back in the summer of 2017. The first bank, he gave the teller a note demanding big bills or else she would be shot. She locked her drawer and walked away. The following morning, he tried a different bank, again with a note saying that he had a gun, but instead of handing over any money, the teller told the robber she was going to go talk to the manager, and again, he got nothing. And that same day, he tried again, and again, he came away empty-handed. He was arrested the next day and charged with the 3 counts, I guess, of attempted bank robbery because he didn't actually get anything, but still some pretty serious charges, all for nothing. Bank robberies are considered now a high-risk, low-reward endeavor. But this wasn't always the case. Bank robberies used to be high-risk, high-reward. In decades past, bank robbers, especially those who we may even describe as masterminds at it, if they planned it right and the plan went through accordingly, they'd be able to get away with hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars. And we are going to discuss one of those bank robberies from the past. This one having taken place in the 1970s. In today's 92nd episode of California Dreaming, the tale of Nixon's dirty millions. Our story begins in the early 70s in Youngstown, Ohio. 31-year-old Harry Barber, he goes by the nickname of Ace. Sometimes he runs with the local crime ring, guys with nicknames like Ronnie the Crab or Lips Mosseri or Eugene the Animal. They might have him be a lookout or a driver, sometimes a bagman, the guy that collects the proceeds for any of their illegal activities. He also goes around collecting coins earned from the various vending machines around town. Harry was born in Ohio, but because of his mom's arthritis, they relocated to Southern California in 1956, to the city of Southgate to be exact, in order for her to be more comfortable in a warmer climate. While in high school, Harry worked part-time at a local grocery store. Life in California was just as uneventful for him as it would have been back in Ohio. But it seemed as though Harry did what he could to make his own kind of fun. And part of that was driving fast. From the late 50s into the early 60s, Harry would proudly boast that he racked up 41 speeding tickets, which resulted in his driving privileges being revoked. License suspended. Because of that, he decided to head back east to Ohio to live with his grandma in Poland, just across the river from Youngstown. He got himself an Ohio driver's license and he found some work, and as I said, he went around collecting coins from vending machines for his uncle Emil Dincio to be exact. But Harry would not be relegated to this day in and day out wage earning routine. Remember, he's a guy that likes to drive, and he likes to drive fast. Was he any good at it? Well, maybe behind the wheel. He could have been considered pretty good at handling a car going at high rates of speed. He was just caught, pulled over, and ticketed a lot. And it would be his penchant for speed that would have him mixed up in the midst of arguably one of the most infamous crimes in American history. And he would see his mug land on the FBI's 10 most wanted list as well. Because in order to get away with his crimes, he had to drive like a bat out of hell. In 1972, murmurings of a big-time heist began making its way through Youngsville. a bank robbery, and they were going to take their crime to the highest level. They were going to go after President Richard M. Nixon. It came in the form of an anonymous tip, but according to a fantastic article that I read on this case in the Orange County Register, this tip was very detailed and comprehensive. It involved President Nixon's re-election fund, a secretive fund, funds that were illegally gotten, extorted specifically from lobbyists who represented dairy farmers. And Nixon had reportedly stashed this money with the help of a friend and attorney named B.B. Rebozo in some safe deposit boxes located in a bank in San Clemente, California. And the amount of money Nixon had reportedly amassed in secret? $30 million. And the person who had this tip for the Ohio criminal syndicate, this tipster wanted to be paid money, and in exchange, he would provide the address of the bank where President Nixon's money had been secreted. Harry knew this was a good tip, worth a significant amount of money. The scandal would actually not be publicly known until late 1973, so the tipster definitely had some inside information. Nobody else knew this was going on. And this scandal was indeed a thing that was happening in the dairy industry. It is commonly known as the milk fund scandal, and this is what purportedly occurred. In 1971, President Nixon strategically lowered the price of milk, and the result of that was less profits for dairy farmers. In turn, lobbyists advocating for the Associated Milk Producers Incorporated made a secretive contribution to Nixon's campaign fund to the tune of $2 million if he would undo what he did and raise milk prices back up again, which Nixon did. All of this would eventually come out while the Watergate investigation was going on, as on one of the infamous tapes, President Nixon can be heard speaking to former Texas Governor John Connally, who had been acting as Nixon's middle person in his negotiations with the dairy farmers. On the tape, Nixon can be heard saying, quote, "Maybe he can shake them down for a little bit more." The milk fund wasn't ever $30 million, but there were other secret funds that Nixon was squirreling away, and all of that too was well documented. According to the Register, an Illinois corporate insurance executive named Clement Stone clandestinely donated $2 million to Nixon's re-election campaign. Investment banker Robert Vesco made a $200,000 secret contribution as well. And business magnate Howard Hughes gave Bebe Rebozo another $100,000, and he would hide that money in his own personal safe deposit box. You see, Nixon was scrambling actually, under the pressure of a very hard deadline to get as much as he could from as many anonymous donors as possible, that deadline being April 7th, 1972, because a new law would be going into effect that would require anyone making campaign donations to reveal who they are, whereas before they could remain anonymous. As for Harry, well, he is not that savvy when it comes to politics. He was just a go-with-the-flow kind of guy, even when it came to becoming involved in the various activities, legal or otherwise, specifically with his Uncle Emil. And on one particular day, while he was going around town picking up coins from his uncle's vending machines, there was one that had a note taped to it, and it read, quote, "Ace, I'll see you tonight." That was his uncle's nickname for him. And the note wasn't left there as a sweet gesture from uncle to nephew. It meant something. It meant something was up. And nothing about Harry's life would ever be the same after that night. Ace met up with Uncle Emil at his grandma's house. He had caught wind of the potential of a job, a pretty big job, and it was a good one. He told Harry he received a tip that President Nixon had $30 million stashed in some safe deposit boxes at a bank out in California, and he wanted to steal it. Uncle Emil paid the tipster for the information, but how much he paid, he didn't say. And the money was located at United California Bank, located in Monarch Bay Plaza in Laguna Niguel, not too far away from San Clemente, where the place known as the Western White House was located. The Western White House is called La Casa Pacifica, which is Spanish for the House of Peace. It is a mansion in San Clemente that was used by President Nixon as his official residence when he wasn't at the actual White House in Washington, D.C., and it was just north of California's Camp Pendleton Marine Base. Uncle Emil was a pretty well-known guy in Youngstown, Ohio. At the time, in 1972, he was 36 years old, and that was only 5 years older than Harry, his nephew. The Orange County Register described Emil as kind of a folk hero. He came from humble beginnings and decided early on for his own family that they would have nothing less than the best when it came to their home, their cars, their jewels, and their clothes. Emil spared no expense, giving his family everything. And not only was he generous with his family, he was generous in the community. And Harry very much looked up to his uncle. He was known not only for his generosity, but his compassion, his kindness, his big heart. A very loving family man and member of his community. But there was another side to Emil Dincio. He was a criminal. He was the head of a network of crooks, about 100 of them. A variety of shady, underhanded individuals. Con men, swindlers, loan sharks, strong-arm guys, safecrackers, getaway drivers, just an assortment of thieves and cheats. And they weren't a bunch of bumbling fools either. They were very serious. They considered themselves a conglomerate of businessmen. But for this job in Laguna Niguel, Emil was going to recruit his family members for the most part. Also in on the plan to head west included 2 more of Harry's uncles, James Dincio and Charlie Mulligan, as well as Harry's own little brother, Ronnie. At this meeting at Grandma's, Emil gave a detailed rundown of the plan to pull this job off, and Harry listened intently, because to him, this sounded genius. For all intents and purposes, what was coming together before him was the perfect heist. Harry told the Orange County Register, this was easy street. There wasn't going to be any publicity. Nobody coming after us. What was Nixon going to say? They took money from the milk scam that I pulled? Here's the thing about Emil Dincio. Prior to his plan to rob the United California Bank, he and his men were one of the most inexhaustible team of bank robbers in American history. It had been estimated that they were able to pull off at least 30 bank robberies and get away with more than $20 million. The FBI would even say when it came to bank robberies, these guys were second to none. So Emil began to put his plan in motion. On February 21st, 1972, Emil traveled to California with his wife Linda and her brother, his brother-in-law, Charlie Mulligan. They stayed in the city of Linwood, California and checked into a room at the Jubilee Motel. They would stay there for 15 days while Emil cased his target. He came to the conclusion that he would have to recruit a couple more guys for this particular job, an alarm expert and some muscle. He returned to Ohio to fill those positions. Enter into the story Charlie Brockle, and we will call him Charlie B from this point forward to differentiate him from Emil's brother-in-law, Charlie Mulligan. Charlie B has been referred to as hands down the best alarm guy money could buy. He also recruited Phil Christopher as the strong arm guy. Also, he was an enforcer with the Cleveland Mafia. And with that, Emil had his 7 guys. 7 guys determined to get their hands on the president's dirty millions. And they were ready. Harry received his plane ticket in the mail. 5 of the 7 were scheduled to fly to California from Ohio on March 15, 1972. And they made no attempt at hiding their identities, confident that nobody would have any idea it was them who would be pulling off this job. From the airport, they hailed a cab and headed to Harry's parents' house in Southgate. Harry's brother Ronnie still lived there. The cabbie was a nice guy from Ghana, Africa. He would remember this specific fare for one reason: the $100 tip that he received from the ever-generous Emil. So what's the first thing you do when you're getting ready to hit the target of your robbery? You make a list and you check it twice. Obviously, most of us aren't bank robbers, but we've read about them. The only bank robbery we've covered on California Dreaming has been the North Hollywood one, which we covered way back in episode 13, The Tale of 44 Minutes. Those 2 guys, Larry Phillips Jr. and Emil Mataserano, had spent a significant amount of time planning for their big heist, and it was going to be one of those takeover robberies. But their plan wasn't necessarily going to be get in and out quickly. The plan all along was to be prepared for a confrontation with police, to be impervious to their weapons and at the same time be able to outgun them with superior firepower. But this would not be Emil Dincio's plan. His bank robbery was going to be much, much different. They were not going to be hindered by a time constraint. They were going to take their time. This was going to be systematic. It was going to be methodical. So they needed a list. First, they needed tools. They purchased hacksaws, acetylene torches, a motor, drill bits, copper wiring, sledgehammers, flashlights, walkie-talkies, gloves, ski masks, and explosives. They needed some weapons. They purchased a couple of shotguns and some automatic weapons. Emil had actually attempted to purchase a shotgun from a local pawn shop, but when he tried to pay with a check, they refused to take it because he had an out-of-state ID. So his nephew, Ronnie, ended up getting it for him. Ronnie wasn't really going to be an integral part of the robbery squad. He had gone to Vietnam, and when he came back, he was only a shell of his former self. Something had happened to him. Maybe it was the Agent Orange. Maybe it was seeing the horrors of warfare. Whatever it was, Ronnie was unwell, and it seemed permanent. Helping to purchase the shotgun was one of the few things he would be able to do for the overall plan. They also got some police scanners, and they had those dialed in to the local law enforcement's radio frequencies. Harry was tasked with securing the hideout, and he found a very nice place, a condo located near the El Niguel Golf Course in Laguna Niguel, also located near the United California Bank. Harry paid the rent up front, 2 months in total. Next, they needed a getaway car. For this, an alias was used. Charlie Mulligan was the one who made this transaction under the name Jimmy Wright, a guy from Glendale, California. He purchased a 1962 Oldsmobile Super 88, which is a pretty large 4-door sedan with a huge trunk. They removed the inside of the bottom of the trunk, hid all of their equipment down there, and then replaced it. Once Charlie was finished with his assignment, which was getting the car, he had some free time on his hands. So he decided to try and get in touch with an old friend from high school from back in Ohio, a man named Early Dawson. He knew Early had moved to Orange County, to the city of Tustin, and he hadn't seen him in at least 20 years. Early had joined the Marines after high school and ended up in California. He had a modest little house with a modest little wife. Tustin wasn't too far from the United California Bank. No harm in catching up with an old friend, right? Charlie looked up Early's number and gave him a call. The Walnut Room was Early Dawson's favorite haunt. There he shot some pool, he had some beers, and it was conveniently close to where he lived. Early was living his quiet, best life when one day he received a call from an old friend, Charlie Mulligan from high school. It had been forever. Charlie was in California for a bank heist, but he had time to catch up with Early. Of course, Early wasn't privy to the actual reason his old buddy was in California, but before long he would be. Early suggested that they have a few beers and hang out for a bit. He invited him to come down to the Walnut Room. They met and went on and on about the last 20 years and what each man had been up to. At the time, Charlie was out of work. He was a barber by trade, so he was a good conversationalist, having years of practice chatting it up with clients as his clippers buzzed away. And Charlie had what's been described as stylish movie star looks, with semi-long, often unkempt hair. Charlie is also the one member of Harry's family that he trusts the least. His Uncle Charlie, his uncle by marriage, his biological uncle's wife's brother. Even though Harry himself was still a novice when it came to these quote-unquote jobs that Emil cooked up, he felt Charlie was the one most likely to be the kink in the armor. Charlie liked to drink, and there are different types of drinkers. There are happy drunks, and there are mean drunks, and there are sleepy drunks. Well, Charlie was a stupid drunk. And if they were going to go down for this heist, Charlie would be the first person Harry would point his finger at as being most likely to have screwed things up. In the meantime, Early asked Charlie if he wanted to hang out a bit more at his house. It was your typical California earthy tone stucco home, with a garage suited for 2 cars. And when Charlie noticed Early's garage, he had an idea. He kind of sort of needed a place to park his 1962 Oldsmobile that he had purchased. The one with the hidden trunk compartment stocked with their burglary equipment. Could his friend do him a favor and let him store his car in his garage for a couple of weeks, maybe a little longer? Sure, no problem. He could park his car in the garage. So Charlie parked it for safekeeping as the rest of his robbery squad prepared for the big day. United California Bank. Inside the bowels of its vault, according to the anonymous tipster, contained the illegally gotten funds from President Nixon's milk scam. The president's dirty money. The bank overlooked Pacific Coast Highway, situated in a shopping center with a drugstore on one side and a bar across the parking lot on the other. And at this time in Orange County's past, it was a quiet place. Not very much going on in the way of population, crowds, traffic, not like it is today. And it didn't take very many members of the sheriff's department to patrol the area, mostly populated with aging retirees. So needless to say, our crew of bank robbers are not going to have very much trouble getting set up for this job. The date they had set for their robbery was Friday, March 17th, 1972. The Great St. Patrick's Day Heist, they were certain it would be known as. These guys planned on going down in history. But the group wanted to make sure nobody noticed them taking all of their tools out of the trunk of the car. So they decided the best thing to do would be to stash everything in some bushes along the road close to the bank the night prior to the planned robbery on Thursday, March 16th. They hid the drill, the motor, the sledgehammer, along with a few other items that would be too bulky and conspicuous. But they had a problem. The great St. Patrick's Day heist? It was not to be. When they got back the next day to get their tools to get started, their tools were gone. Some random passerby not minding his own business noticed all of the tools in the bushes and contacted the Orange County Sheriff's Department. All of their things were taken into the lost and found for whoever owned the stuff to claim. They did not, however, connect the dots between the tools and the bank. And as I read this, I was wondering, what did the random passerby and the sheriffs think of all those tools across the street from the bank were all about? I can't say that I would automatically think it had anything to do with the planned bank robbery. Those were not the things typical bank robbers would bring with them. Most likely, they thought it was stolen property that was hastily dumped for whatever reason. But to Emil, this was nothing more than a minor setback. A week at most. No, they weren't going to go down to the sheriff's station and make the claim at the lost and found, although I thought that would be kind of bold and funny if they happened to do it and get away. Having the sheriffs give them back their stuff so they could turn around and pull off what they think is going to be the crime of the century. By the following Friday, March 24th, the robbery crew were able to gather up the equipment to replace the stuff taken in by the sheriffs. This time they found a better hiding spot, an out-of-the-way area where pedestrians aren't likely to pass by and turn their stuff over to the sheriff again. And when they came back to retrieve their items, they were still there. And here began what the Orange County Register referred to as the great 7 days after St. Patrick's Day heist, which I thought was catchy and funny. The last thing these guys needed was a ladder. At first, they thought they might steal one from someone's garage, but then they noticed a nearby church and they had an aluminum ladder kept on the side of the building. They didn't think anyone would move it within the next day, so they planned on coming back the night of the heist to get it. But why a ladder to rob the bank? Well, they weren't going to go through the front door and they weren't going to go through the back door either. They were going to get into the bank through the roof. Sounded like a lot of work. A lot of time-consuming work, doesn't it? Yeah, it does. But you see, back in the 1970s, most banks were closed on weekends. Nobody would be back in the building until Monday morning. That gave the crew Friday night, all of Saturday, and all of Sunday to work. At the rented condo, Harry set up all the surveillance equipment that he had. He dialed into both the Orange County Sheriff's radio frequency as well as a local police department. And Harry had one goal: to know more about the police than the police knew about the police. If he could do that, then they were good as gold. They also got their walkie-talkies going on a special frequency so nobody would be likely listening in. The heist was to commence sometime in the middle of the night, under a cloak of darkness. Everyone had on dark-colored clothing and gloves. The strong-arm muscle guy, Phil Christopher, the one connected to the mob back in Ohio, he was a lookout. He was armed with a machine gun. They did not anticipate too much activity around the bank or the parking lot area that late hour of the night, but just in case, Phil was ready. As he watched and Harry listened, Emil, his brother James, Charlie, and Charlie B made their way towards the bank. They quietly went out the back patio and crossed the golf course. In their pockets, they carried some small jars of ground-up chili pepper in the event they encountered any dogs or other wild animals. They also had with them their duffel bags filled with their tools, the alarm equipment, dynamite, blasting caps, a drill, a keyhole saw, crowbars, screwdrivers, sledgehammers, binoculars, and a whole bunch of empty burlap potato sacks and rope. The bags are going to be filled with dirt in order to mask the sound of the blast. They had a drill custom made using the motor from a floor fan, which would enable the drill to operate at a higher RPM than a regular drill. It was equipped with a 1-inch carbide bit, and that was capable of pulverizing concrete. And onto this drill, they welded 2 large handles in order to be able to maintain a firm grip on the drill. They also had this thing that they fashioned with some bottles and rubber tubes designed to shoot liquid styrofoam into the bell on the alarm box located on the outside of the building. This would disable the alarm by preventing the bell from being able to chime, as the styrofoam would harden very fast. They arrived at the church and grabbed the ladder and scurried back into the cover of some nearby trees. From this vantage point, they could see the entire parking lot of the bank. One of them scanned the area with binoculars and everything was clear. There was, however, a trailer parked nearby where a guard was posted to keep an eye on the parking lot for the night. He was busy watching TV. Satisfied that they were in the clear, they began making their way down the hillside towards the far end of the parking lot. They decided that Emil, James, and Charlie B would be the ones to go up onto the roof to gain entry into the bank. Charlie was tasked with staying on the ground to help bring up the equipment as needed, as well as keep his eye on the guard in the trailer. The ladder was leaned up against the side of the bank, and it was just barely high enough to get them onto the roof. They grabbed some of their tools and the alarm equipment and ascended the ladder. When they got to the roof, they were directly above the adjacent drugstore. They walked across and made their way around a large rooftop air conditioning unit before finding themselves directly above the bank. Based on what they knew of the layout of the bank from the time they spent casing it, they decided where the spot on the roof was directly above the vault. James started with what they called their in tools. He retrieved his L bar, which is pretty much what it sounds like, a steel bar shaped like an L. He began scraping at the small stones that dotted the gravel rooftop. From there, he got down to the tar paper layer and pulled that away from the wooden part of the roof, which was the next layer. When the wood was exposed and using the AC unit nearby as a power source, they drilled 1 hole and then took the keyhole saw and began cutting. 3 more holes were drilled to form a square that was about 30 inches by 30 inches or 76 centimeters by 76 centimeters. Once they were finished sawing through the wood, they used the crowbar to pry out the square that they had cut. With the flashlight and ski masks on, Emil and Charlie B went inside the hole in the roof. James waited on top. They moved very quietly across the top of the bank's vault and over to a built-in ladder that led down into the lobby of the bank. They went down one by one, looking for the wiring that connected the alarm to the telephone wires. They stayed low, crossed the lobby, and back behind the counter where the tellers usually stand. From there, they found the utility box, where the phone box was located. But as Charlie B, the alarm guy, looked through all the wires inside the box, he did not see any of them connected to an alarm. He had a hard time believing that the place would not be wired to an alarm, but for all his looking around, there was nothing. So they went back up the vault ladder. At this point, they noticed another conduit that ran alongside the vault. Thinking this may have been the alarm, they cut into it, but it was a wiring for the bank's power. Again, no alarm. They climbed back up and emerged from the square cutout. They carefully put the wood piece back. James took a small can of tar and did a little bit of patching to camouflage the hole that they'd cut. Then he affixed a small mirror to the tar and pointed it in such a way that it would reflect the sunlight so they could see it with their binoculars from their adjacent hillside. They signaled for Charlie, who had been hiding out of sight nearby with the ladder. He came back, set the ladder up against the building again, and they climbed down. They hid the ladder deep into the nearby trees. They made their way back to the condo, sweaty and tired from the night's work. As they sat, drinking and cooling down, they tried to figure out their next move. They just weren't sure what to do about the alarm wires. Where could they be? Maybe Charlie hadn't looked closely enough. Maybe they were located in a drugstore. But they can't break into the drugstore because they're open on weekends and they wouldn't be able to finish their bank job. Charlie B decided to take a walk, to clear his mind to think about the alarm and what he may have missed. As he walked around the golf course, he realized something. The alarm must have been on a closed circuit. That was an antiquated system by this time, but it didn't occur to him that the old bank might still be using the old system. And if this were the case, then it would not be a problem getting around it. Those are easy to short circuit. They decided to go back the next night as soon as it got dark. They kept an eye on their cutout square. Nothing was disturbed. Nobody noticed anything amiss. By nightfall, they were back on the roof. They went back down, and Charlie B again searched for the wiring for the alarm, and he found it, and he shorted it out. They went back outside to the bell box, and this is when they sprayed the liquid styrofoam into the bell, which would harden quickly. The styrofoam actually began running down the side of the building, so Charlie quickly took off his t-shirt to wipe it up as much as he could. White foam running down from the bell box would be very suspicious. They tested it by attempting to set off the alarm. They scrambled back out of the bank and hid in some nearby bushes and waited for police to show up. Nothing. Now that both the exterior alarm and the interior alarms were disabled, they were ready to get back into the bank. They got the ladder and headed up the side of the building once again. Emil brought up the dynamite and the blasting caps and a small bag of tools, and James had the drill and the rope. Phil and Charlie kept watch and waited for Harry and Ronnie to get there. They hid the ladder again, and while Ronnie was a lookout, Charlie and Phil began filling the burlap potato sacks with dirt, tied them to the end of the rope, and they were hoisted onto the roof, one by one. When they were done, Phil went up on the roof, and Charlie took the ladder back to the woods and hid and waited again. James began drilling holes deep into the concrete roof of the vault, creating a big circle of holes with one hole in the middle. The circle was about 3 feet in diameter. Next, they went down into the roof with their dynamite and blasting caps. They cut the dynamite into 3-inch pieces, putting the blasting caps in, and pushed each piece of dynamite into each hole using a screwdriver to get them in there. They next began piling their bags of dirt all around the top, covering the vault ceiling and dynamite. They connected the wiring and stepped back about 30 feet or 9 meters away. They were really worried about the sound of the blast. They could see the guard in his trailer from where they were perched. They could see his hand resting on his gun. The men looked at each other. Phil nodded to Emil. He then took the exposed ends of his wires, touched them on the electrical lines from the AC unit, and blew their dynamite. It made a thud sound, and then it was quiet. The bags of dirt did their job. But the blast didn't clear away all of the concrete from the roof. So James took a sledgehammer and began pounding at what was left, and soon much of that fell apart as well. All they had left now to do was to cut through the steel reinforced rods with their acetylene torches. As they worked to cut through the rebar, James stood by to catch each piece before it fell into the vault below. Once every piece of the steel rod was cut through, they waited about 10 minutes for all the dust and smoke to clear so they could peer down into the vault. And they signaled Charlie, hiding in the trees with the ladder, to come back over and come up with the ladder, which he did, pulling it onto the roof behind him. They were in. All of this went on, the climbing all over the roof of the building, the sawing, the drilling, the blasting their way in, everything without one single person taking notice of any of it. Not one person who was at the bar just across the parking lot, no one who had their cars parked nearby, no one who passed by on Pacific Coast Highway. Nothing. Through the dust and smoke caused by all of their drilling, blasting, and torching, they were able to make out about 500 safe deposit boxes, and 2 small safes as well that weren't going to be a problem for these guys to get into. Charlie and James worked on the 2 safes while Emil and Phil began breaking into the safe deposit boxes using a custom sledgehammer with one end like a regular sledgehammer and the other end sharpened into a pointed tip that would fit into the keyholes of each box. They'd bash the end of the sledgehammer with another sledgehammer, one by one, popping open each box. They didn't know which boxes belonged to Nixon, so they just kept going. Box after box after box, hoping the next one would have their prizes for all of their hard work. All sorts of stuff began falling out of these boxes. The valuable belongings of bank customers, jewelry, rare coins, cash, stocks, bonds, important documents. As they went through, they took what they wanted and dumped everything else onto the floor of the vault. In the meantime, James and Charlie got those safes open, and those contained about $55,000 in cash, which wasn't a lot for these guys who were looking for $30 million. They came back to the safe deposit box room of the vault to help break open more of the boxes. The robbers were also finding an assortment of odd things as well. Locks of hair, teeth, baby shoes, people's ashes. They decided after a few hours that they were tired and it was time to call it a night. The sun would be coming up in about an hour, so it was time to go anyway. They didn't come across Nixon's dirty millions just yet, but they'd be coming back the next night. They'd get it then. They grabbed their bags of valuables and cash that they wanted to keep, brought them up out of their rooftop entrance and exit, put the section of roof back that they cut out, patched it up again with tar, and affixed the mirror. The burglars made their way back to the vault on Sunday night. They were only 10 hours away from the bank being reopened Monday morning. They managed to get into a total of 458 safe deposit boxes when all was said and done, and they would walk away with nearly $9 million worth of cash, stocks, bonds, and jewelry, which would be about $54 million today. Before they left for the last time, they jammed a screwdriver into the vault's door locking mechanism so the bank employees would not be able to get in right away to see what they had done over the weekend. But the one thing that they didn't find was Nixon's dirty millions. The tipster had sold them some BS information and really got one over on them. The dirty millions did exist. They were in a bank. They were in a vault in some safe deposit boxes, but not at Union California Bank of Laguna Niguel. The money was 9 miles or 14.5 kilometers away at the Bank of America in San Clemente. The robbers gathered up all their tools and equipment, packed it all back into their Oldsmobile and slammed it shut, with an anger and disappointment that they were sold this bad tip. I mean, they got away with lots of loot, but it wasn't $30 million. Anyway, they had to get moving. Emil instructed Harry to take the car back to Charlie's old friend's house, Early Dawson. Now, this was an unusual move. They usually set the car on fire when they ditched it. For some reason, this time, Emil wanted the car back in Early's garage. Even though Harry was kind of a small fish in a big pond, he knew when he did the math that the take wasn't going to be as big as they had hoped for, that $30 million that they'd hoped for. They figured that they would get about half of what everything was worth once they cashed in all the stocks, bonds, and sold the jewelry and everything. They'd probably come away with about $4 million. Between the 7 of them, minus Ronnie because he wasn't going to be paid anything, Harry was expecting at the very least $500,000. But he didn't get anything even close to that amount. All he was given was $12,000, plus a guarantee. There would be more. Harry just took his share and kept quiet. $12,000 could go a long way in 1972. That's more than $73,000 when you entered that into the inflation calculator. And he trusted his Uncle Emile when he says there was more to come. He just needed to be patient. On Monday, March 27th, it was time to clear out of the condo that they had rented. Harry hired a cleaning service and paid them $240, and that's a lot. In the inflation calculator, that's almost $1,500 today. But he wanted to make sure that any evidence of them ever having been there needed to be obliterated. Every last fingerprint, every last fiber, every last hair. And the cleaning crew did a phenomenal job. They scrubbed down all the walls, they mopped up all the floors, they vacuumed all the carpets and furniture, tidied up the bathrooms, the toilets, the tubs, the sinks, and they loaded up the dishwasher. He let the cleaning crew know that it needed to be meticulous. He wanted to make sure that nothing in that condo could be traced back to them. It was time to hit the road and head back to Ohio. But they couldn't exactly fly with all of this loot, right? They needed to find a way to get all this stuff across the country, so they purchased a boat and a trailer. They loaded it up and headed to Las Vegas to unload some of the stuff, to sell it, to pawn it, to launder it, whatever they intended to do. After that, a portion of the proceeds would stay on the boat and would be hauled all the way to Ohio. Some of the proceeds would be headed to New Orleans, and some of it was going to be handed over to a guy named Harry Hall, or Harry Haler, Harry Helfgott, Harry Sinclair, or Harry Berman. He had a variety of aliases. And according to the Register, who interviewed an attorney who defended a mob connection client who had been convicted of threatening Harry Hall's life, Harry Hall is the crookedest human being to ever walk the face of the planet, he said. But no matter who Harry Hall scammed, nobody ever really seemed to hold a grudge against the guy. People just liked him. Harry Hall had an eclectic background. He once roomied with Jack Ruby, the guy who shot and killed Lee Harvey Oswald, the guy who was accused of killing President John F. Kennedy. Jimmy Hoffa was Harry Hall's union boss. As a matter of fact, Harry Hall once led an investigative team on a search for Hoffa's body in a Michigan swamp. Turned out it was a wild goose chase. As you know, Hoffa's whereabouts are still unknown. Harry Hall also claimed that when Marilyn Monroe died, Joe DiMaggio invited him to the funeral. The FBI didn't really believe the story until one of the agents saw some footage of Marilyn's funeral on TV, and lo and behold, right next to DiMaggio stood none other than Harry Hall. He was employed as a quote-unquote public relations guy for the Los Angeles Teamsters, but he was really a snitch, working closely with government agencies like the FBI and the IRS. It was sort of his get-out-of-jail-free card. Whenever he would get caught up in some trouble of his own from any one of his various underhanded cons, he would start rolling over on other people that he had been close to, people who had trusted this guy. It isn't certain how the money stolen from the Laguna Niguel heist ended up with Harry Hall, but an investigation into it later on revealed that a week after the burglary, the Los Angeles Teamsters gave a fledgling public relations firm in Las Vegas a $1.3 million contract. And this is a firm that barely cleared $20,000 the previous year. And it was also discovered that the PR firm had a silent partner. Once again, none other than Harry Hall. The FBI has figured that the Laguna Niguel loot had already been making its way through Vegas before anyone knew anything was amiss inside that vault that Monday morning following the robbery. When bank employees arrived on Monday, the manager tried and failed to open the vault. It was a head-scratcher. He was the one who had the combination and it never failed on him until that morning. He called up a local locksmith. He'd be by later in the day. But when the locksmith got there, he couldn't get the thing open either. And I was kind of wondering myself, even if the lock hadn't been damaged and jammed by the bank robbers, would some random locksmith out of the Yellow Pages be able to crack a bank vault? Maybe a really good locksmith, I guess. But when this locksmith threw up his hands and told the bank manager he couldn't do it, he knew then that he had a serious problem. He contacted law enforcement, and then the FBI would get involved since bank robberies are their jurisdiction. That afternoon, FBI agent Jim Conway, working out of the Santa Ana office, got the call. What they found inside the vault was nothing short of a disaster. It looked as though a tornado had blown through. The burlap potato bags filled with dirt were blown to bits and strewn all over the place. Chunks of obliterated concrete, safe deposit boxes that had been smashed open, and customers' personal effects were everywhere. Paperwork and jewelry, even some cash was left behind, just haphazardly thrown about. In some corners of the vault, debris piled up several feet high. When Agent Conway walked into the vault, he had no other choice but to trample over the personal belongings of so many people who thought that they were keeping their priceless items safe by storing them in safe deposit boxes inside the vault of this bank. But there was no other way to go but through it. And on this day, Agent Conway was just a few months away from finally retiring after a long and storied career as an FBI agent. One look at what these bank robbers left behind, it was clear that this was unlike any bank robbery he had ever seen in his life. They had disabled the alarms, they had blown through concrete, they severed steel rebar. Whoever committed this crime, they were no lightweights. As Agent Conway described it, this was sophisticated. And not only was the vault itself a tremendous disaster, also disastrous was the realization as to how challenging the task would be to figure out exactly what went missing. The bank didn't keep track of anything other than its own money and assets. Whatever people put into these safe deposit boxes, it would be up to each and every customer to be able to come up with that information for investigators. Customers began arriving at the bank, doing what they could to get inside the vault to see what, if anything, they had left of the valuables that they had entrusted the bank with the safekeeping of. And to compound the problem, Agent Conway had absolutely no idea who he was looking for, nor did he know what it was in the safe deposit boxes that they were looking for, whether it was cash or jewels or something else hidden in one of these boxes that they were specifically targeting. And that was quite an astute guess, not too far off the mark. Those robbers had something in mind that they were looking for, namely President Nixon's millions. This was a targeted attack. It's just the robbers missed their mark. So when the FBI finally called for a press conference to address the robbery, they provided the only information that they could confirm up to that point. $50,000 had been stolen from the bank. They downplayed the enormity of the take, that's for sure. It would not be known until later on, once a complete inventory of everything that was stolen was finally compiled. The true extent of the take from this robbery, it would eclipse the amount that had been the largest robbery up to that point. The 1950s Brinks armored truck robbery, in which the robbers made away with $2.7 million, which today would be about $28 million. Whoever pulled off this heist, they were good at what they did. Not one single fingerprint was found inside the vault. Not only that, the money that they did take from those two small safes, not all of those bills' serial numbers were recorded. So unless Agent Conway gets a viable tip or lead, he's going to be chasing a ghost. All he's got is this. They gained entry through the roof. The tools that they used included drills, torches, and sledgehammers. One of their men had experience working with electronics and alarms. Another one of their men knew how to set up and detonate explosives. And there was at least a half a dozen of them. That was the extent of what he knew thus far. And while Conway was trying to figure out what his next move is going to be, the bank set aside an area with a desk where customers could provide them with a list of things that they were missing or the things that they would be able to retrieve from what was left behind. But it didn't take long before the customers went ahead and filed a lawsuit against United California Bank. And the amount sought in damages? $26 million. Today, that amount would be nearly $160 million. Agent Conway assembled a team of his own to work this investigation. He gathered up 8 of his guys. They started off by going to various hardware stores, places that sold or rented the kinds of equipment used to break through the cement and rebar. They tried every place they could think of in the surrounding areas and came up with nothing. Agent Conway issued an all-points bulletin, which meant this was going to make its way to every FBI office across the United States. He listed in great detail how the robbery was pulled off to see if it matched anything any other agent in the country had ever seen before. And still, he had nothing. And all the while all of this was going on, somehow, some way, President Nixon discovered the bank robbery that took place in Laguna Niguel had been targeting his stash of milk fund scandal money. But what the robbers didn't know was this. What exactly did President Nixon know? How did he come to know this? And when did he find out? These were the burning questions that plagued the robbers, and it made them mad. This was supposed to be a super secret operation. And the reason that they were sure Nixon knew was because 3 days after that Monday morning the disaster was discovered in the vault, G. Gordon Liddy was given the go-ahead, along with the money, to set up that wiretap at the Watergate Hotel where the Democratic National Committee was headquartered, which Liddy would go on to do with his own crew of 5 men in May of '72 and then again in June. And it also leaves us wondering about this burning question. Is it possible that Nixon's Watergate wiretapping fiasco was actually triggered by the fact that his dirty money had been targeted in the Laguna bank robbery? Those close to Nixon's inner circle have maintained that they never heard about the bank robbery and what they were looking for. But the robbers themselves, they're not convinced. Especially a week later, the FBI upped the number of agents working on the case from 8 to 125, and the case was taken out of the hands of the Orange County FBI office and handed over to agents working out of the more experienced Los Angeles office. With that, and the 125 agents working the case, It was the largest investigation thus far the FBI had been involved in terms of manpower. That is until Watergate happened 3 months later. So for now, everybody in the robbery squad went on with their lives. Harry Barber had flown out of California to Chicago with his Uncle Emil and then back home to Ohio. He had his $12,000 from the Laguna robbery. He was looking forward to more heists in the future, as promised by Emil. And so Harry was feeling like he was in a good place in life at this point. Then he had an idea. He headed over to the Cleveland airport and got himself a one-way ticket back to California. First class on the biggest plane they had to offer at the time, 747. Just because, according to Harry, he wanted to fly on one. I guess it didn't cross his mind that about 125 FBI agents were crawling all over Southern California looking for him. He just turned around before the month of March had even ended and headed straight back. And while Harry was kicking back at his parents' house in Southgate, California, relaxing and enjoying the money he had earned from the bank robbery, he's feeling rich and he's feeling free, just a couple of cities over from the Los Angeles FBI office that are doing everything they can to track him down. But they were going nowhere fast. A couple of months went by and all was quiet. That is until May 24th, 1972. The Los Angeles FBI office received a call from their Cleveland counterparts. They tell LA that they've been experiencing a rash of bank robberies that appear to be eerily similar to what happened out there at United California Bank in Laguna Niguel. Their robbers used liquid styrofoam to silence the outside bell alarm. They came through the roof and they entered the vault by blasting their way in. And they finally were able to provide Los Angeles FBI agents with a name of one of their persons of interest. A guy who had been on their radar for quite some time. They just hadn't been able to connect him to anything. Good old Uncle Emil. And their investigation into Emil uncovered some interesting information. He, along with 4 buddies, Phil Christopher, Charlie Mulligan, Charlie Brockle, and Harry Barber, had taken a flight from Cleveland to Los Angeles 9 days before the Laguna Niguel heist. Finally, the agents investigating the largest bank robbery in American history have had their first lead. They take all of these guys' mugshots. Each of them has one, of course, and head over to Los Angeles International Airport, and they start asking around about these guys, beginning with the taxicab drivers. After hours of talking to what seems like an endless stream of cab drivers that regularly make their way through LAX, they finally talk to just the right one. The cabbie who hailed from Ghana, Africa. Yep, he knows Emil Dincio, as he looked at his picture. He totally remembers this guy. Why? Because he generously tipped him that $100 bill. That isn't a thing that happened every day, and that would be the beginning of Emil and his crew's downfall. Because not only did the cabbie remember the tip, he remembered the address as well. That house in Southgate. That's Emil's sister's house. Harry and Ronnie Barber's mother. FBI agent Jim Conway heads right over to the Barber home. He finds Ronnie Barber, but Harry wasn't home at the time. Even though Ronnie had invoked his right to remain silent, which incidentally had just become a thing a few years back in 1966 in the Miranda versus Arizona ruling, Agent Conway didn't get anything out of him, but he got a vibe, a guilty vibe. He is so close to retirement, and throughout his career, he's looked into the eyes of many a guilty persons. But for now, Agent Conway was going to leave the barber home without taking anybody into custody. A short time later, Harry arrived and Ronnie filled him in. The FBI showed up. Harry was ready to get the heck out of Dodge, which they do. This investigation was beginning to pick up a little bit of steam. The FBI tried talking to Viola Barber, Ronnie and Harry's mom, but she gives up nothing. And they are pretty sure she's holding back information as well. Agents secured a warrant to obtain the phone records from the barber's home, and they found some calls that had been made to a Laguna Niguel real estate agent. A huge break, and we will come back to that momentarily. They could tell by the size of the Southgate home that it was not big enough to accommodate the family and a crew of bank robbers, so they surmised that they must have rented a hotel nearby. The agents canvassed the area, stopping in at all the hotels and motels in and around the Southgate area that they could find, and they eventually came across the Jubilee. And what do you know? 2 rooms had been previously registered to 2 of their suspects, Emil Dincio and Charlie Mulligan. And if you recall, Charlie Mulligan was the one who had some downtime after he had secured that getaway car. And he thought about getting in touch with that old friend of his from back in high school, the one who had joined the Marines and ended up living in Tustin, California. His old friend named Early Dawson. Well, his name popped up on Charlie's hotel room phone bill. So Agent Conway reached out to the Santa Ana FBI office and asked them to run Early Dawson's name. Nothing much really came up other than some DUI arrests. He was a retired Marine, but then, as he was looking at Early's background check teletype, something amazingly huge jumped out at the agent. Early Dawson's place of birth is none other than Youngstown, Ohio, the very place where Emil and his band of crooks are centered. This is really beginning to come together. Agent Conway, along with one guy from the Santa Ana office, headed over to Early's house, but he wasn't there. So they tried again the next day, and still not there. They got word that he liked hanging out at a place called the Walnut Room, so they tried there, at which time they did in fact find him. He was kicking back a few beers, playing some pool, and all of this was just a little bit after 9 a.m. No wonder the guys racked up some DUIs. He gets started early. The agents, dressed in their black suits, of course, are probably standing out in the Walnut Room, and they are looking directly at Early, and he feels them looking at him. So he told them, "You're staring at me." Yep, they sure are. One of the agents suggested that it might be a good idea if they could talk at his house rather than at the pool hall, as his barfly friends were probably going to be looking on. Early agreed, so they went over to his house. And they were impressed with the place. He kept it up pretty nice. He had lots of things that he had collected over the years, places that he went while he served in the Marines. One of the agents was an ex-Marine too. He figured he could use that as a starting point in their conversation. Eventually, the agents brought out the mugshots that they had. Early spotted his friend, Charlie Mulligan, in the bunch. They'd been friends since childhood, from back in Ohio. They finally broke the news to Early. They think Charlie may have taken advantage of their friendship. Early kind of already had that feeling. He thought his friend was acting a little weird, wanting to leave that car parked in his garage, and he never came back for it. The agents asked Early if they could see the car, and he led them to the garage. And there it was, the 1962 Oldsmobile. Just looking through the window into the passenger compartment, the agents immediately spotted all the dirt and dust. The stuff that had covered the inside of the vault covered the inside of the car as well. There was also a glove right there on the back seat. That was enough for them to be able to obtain a search warrant so they could go through the entire car. And just as the men stood in the garage staring at the getaway car, Early's house phone rang. The agents watched as Early took the call. He turned to the agents looking like he'd just seen a ghost. He covered the receiver with his hand and he mouthed Charlie's name. He was calling from Ohio. One of the agents asked in a whisper if he had his permission to listen in on another line in the house. Early agreed, nodding yes. Charlie was calling to see if anybody had come by his house. Early acted like he didn't know what he was talking about. Anybody? Like, who do you mean? Charlie said anybody, like the cops or the FBI. Looking directly at the FBI agents standing in his house, Early says, no cops, no FBI coming around here. Well, Charlie let Early know that he was flying into town later that day. He was going to come and pick up his Oldsmobile. The agent quickly tried to signal to Early to make plans to meet up with Charlie any place other than Early's house. Early complied, instructing Charlie to go ahead and meet him at the Walnut Room when he got to town. He'd be there. And Charlie said okay, he'd see him there. Santa Ana office FBI agent Frank Calley got ready that night to get into character. He was going to blend in with the Walnut Room patrons while he sat next to Early, waiting for Charlie to arrive for their meeting. Finally, Agent Kelly saw as Charlie Mulligan made his way into the bar. Early was sitting at the bar, and it was clear that he was a bit nervous. Kelly had tried to tell him that he can't get drunk, but his nerves got the best of him. By the time Charlie got there, Early was working on his 6th beer. Charlie sat next to him and ordered a beer of his own. Early introduced him to the guy seated next to him. This is his buddy, Frank. But Charlie obviously wasn't there to socialize. He quietly told Early under his breath that he needed to get the car. Agent Kelly tried to hear what they were saying, but it was a little bit loud inside. Then Early looked Charlie in the eye and asked him straight out, "Did you have something to do with that $2 million Laguna bank robbery?" Agent Kelly cringed. He did not want Early asking him anything about this. Charlie said, "Hey, you know me better than that." Then there was this abbreviated pause when Charlie let this statement go. Anyway, it was more like $5 million. Agent Kelly nearly choked on his own beer, and Early knew that his friend was in the process of burying himself. Early and Charlie continued to talk. They shared more beers, played some pool. All the while, FBI agents are converging in force outside in the parking lot. Callie finally came out of character, and Charlie noticed right away that something was up. Agent Callie finally broke the news to him. "I'm with the FBI, and you're under arrest." With Charlie Mulligan in custody, agents quickly made a beeline to Early Dawson's house. They could not wait to get inside that Oldsmobile, and boy did they hit the jackpot. They popped the trunk, and there it was. Everything a bank robber would need to disarm alarms, cut into a roof, blast open a vault, and rampage through hundreds of safe deposit boxes. A custom drill bits, walkie-talkies, flashlights, acetylene torches, sledgehammers, including that custom-made one with a pointed end to pop open box locks, hacksaws, bolt cutters, power cords, and numerous shotguns. But these agents, they weren't done yet. Remember that phone call that I told you about from the Southgate house to the real estate agent in Laguna Niguel? Well, they got in touch with her too. They needed to talk to her about a rental. Some tenants that she rented to back in March. Oh yeah, she remembered them. They paid for 2 months, but left after only about a week or so, maybe a little bit longer. It was weird, and there was no explanation as to why they left. Agent Conway asked if he could come see the place. Sure, come on by. And when he arrived, the real estate agent let him in. At first glance, he was disappointed. The place was flawless and immaculate. Remember, a cleaning crew was paid very well to wipe down the place floor to ceiling. And it looked like the burglary crew got their money's worth. The place was so clean they could literally eat off the floor. It was beginning to look like the condo wasn't going to be giving away any secrets. That is until someone took a look-see in the dishwasher. And what do you know? Of all the guys who stayed there, Emil Dincio, James Dincio, Harry Barber, Ronnie Barber, Charlie Mulligan, Charlie Brockle, and Phil Christopher, not one of them took the time to wash a single dish. Everything had been loaded into the dishwasher, but nobody bothered to hit start. The dishes were not only covered with food, they were covered with all their grubby fingerprints too. Every one of them. They got them all. But by the time the FBI was putting this all together, Harry and Ronnie Barber were long gone. They had hit the road and got the hell out of California. And these guys certainly aren't stupid, though that's debatable. So they won't be heading to Ohio. No, they're gonna go further east than that, all the way to Rochester, New York. Harry knows a guy named Bruce Ruckdeschel. He's the landlord of an apartment complex there, and he gave his old buddy Harry a place to stay and a job as a maintenance guy. So Harry's laying low with his brother. He's got a place, he's got a job. Harry Barber thinks he's set. And he is. For now. The FBI, they don't mess around. They want Harry and Ronnie Barber, and they're going to have to go low in order to get them. They decide to place their mother, Viola, under arrest. They pick her up as she is casually shopping at the local mall. They charge her with perjury. She testified at the grand jury when the charges were being filed against her boys, but neither Harry nor Ronnie turned themselves in order to spare their mom the grief. But the FBI, they weren't done yet. They're not going to give up that easily. Next on their list to take into custody in order to smoke these guys out that they really want is Mary Mulligan, Charlie's mom, Uncle Emil's mother-in-law. When the FBI showed up on her doorstep, she wasn't surprised. She figured they'd be showing up. A search of her home produced nothing. A search of her purse was another story. In her wallet, she had one marked $20 bill from the United California Bank in Laguna Niguel. That's all the FBI needed to slap the cuffs on her, too. Then, on June 20th, Phil Christopher was taken into custody early in the morning at his house in Cleveland. A search of his home uncovered a total of $32,420. Some of the money from Laguna Niguel, but also some from a burglary in Lordstown, Ohio, a town just northwest of Youngstown. They had busted into a bank there in the same manner in which they busted into the bank in Laguna, through the roof, cut alarms, and dynamited their way in. That same month, things went south for Emil Dincio as well. And it had to do with a nosy kid who lived across the street from him, a kid named Michael Sinkel. On June 25th, Michael was awakened by someone digging out in the yard. He looked out the window and he saw his neighbor, Emil, digging a hole. Well, the next day, Michael's curiosity got the best of him. So he went over there where nobody was around and dug up the same spot where he'd seen Emil digging, and he discovered a thermos. He opened it up and found nearly $100,000 in cash. The following day, on June 27, 1972, Emil Dencio was taken into custody by the FBI. Emil is a man who the FBI said was responsible for more than 30 bank robberies, resulting in more than $30 million in stolen money and valuables. Of this, Emil would say it's a frame job perpetrated by the FBI. Another $1.4 million in cash was discovered buried in a field near his house as well. And then in July, back in Laguna Niguel, some land surveyors working near the United California Bank discovered a burlap bag buried under some brush. Inside were 2,000 stock certificates, $30,000 in savings bond, another $10,000 certificate. In all, everything totaled more than $1 million. And not one of these documents had any fingerprints on them. But the FBI knew. They knew exactly who stashed this stuff into the ground. In order to really secure their case against the bank robbery crew, they were going to bring down some heat on the alarm guy, Charlie B. Remember, Harry said if anybody was going to be the weak link, it would be him. The FBI called him the unindicted co-conspirator. Everyone else called him a rat. He rolled over on all his buddies, and the FBI would place him in the witness protection program. So at this point, the FBI had everyone that they wanted. Everyone except for the Barber brothers, Harry and Ronnie. They eventually got a tip that the brothers were in New York. They're staying at an apartment owned by one Bruce Ruckdeschel. 6 months later, the FBI in New York raided the apartment complex and took Ronnie into custody. Harry, however, wasn't home. But when he did make his way home, as he was walking up the street, Harry saw his friend Bruce, and he could tell by the look on his face that something was wrong. Lucky for Harry, Bruce is quite fond of him. He let him know that the FBI had been there and they took his brother into custody. Harry Barber booked it out of there quickly. He left everything behind, got in his car, and drove west out of New York. Of all the Laguna Niguel 7 who tried to steal Nixon's dirty millions, the only one who hadn't been caught happened to be the lowest guy on the totem pole. The guy who got the smallest cut, Harry. And he intended to stay not caught. Harry Barber knew that if he was going to remain free, Harry Barber could be no more. He didn't mind being on the run. He actually kind of liked it. Not knowing where you're going to end up next, but no matter what you do, you can become anyone you want to. You can be anything you want to be. He contacted an attorney friend of his and told him that he needed to vanish. No problem. This attorney looked around in some recent obituaries in the newspaper and picked a name. John Baker. John Baker was going to come back to life. And by tossing his ID into a fire, Harry Barber was dead. Harry assumed that the FBI did their homework and found out that he can't stand living in the cold, and he assumed that they were guessing where he might run to, someplace with warm climate like California or Florida. He was driving through New York, but as he got to Buffalo, he turned south and headed towards Pennsylvania. He was in the depths of winter at this point. But to be honest, dreamers, this really doesn't make much sense if you think about it, because they found him living in New York. Even if the FBI did check up on him and discovered that he did not like living in cold climates, the fact is that they tracked him down living in a cold climate, so that would have squashed that theory. But whatever. Harry seemed to like to think that he could outsmart the FBI at every turn. It was a game and Harry loved playing. But whatever Harry did do, he knew that he couldn't go home. And another guy who wasn't going to be able to go home again was Mr. Early Dawson. As it turned out, he was going to be a star witness in the case against the bank robbers, and he definitely had a target on his back because of it. As the trials were approaching, the FBI caught wind that Early Dawson did indeed have a hit out on him. 2 individuals from Emil's syndicate back in Youngstown, Ohio were given the orders to take Early Dawson out. The plan was for it to go down at Early's favorite place, the Walnut Room. Agent Callie got in touch with Early, and he let him know that there's a hit ordered, and he told him when and where it was going to go down, and that the FBI was going to be there. Callie arranged for the Walnut Room to be crawling with agents, and he told Early 2 things. Make sure you do these 2 things. Don't get drunk, and don't leave the bar, no matter what. Agents are on the inside, not on the outside. But there was one small detail Agent Callie didn't share with Early. He wasn't going to be able to arrest the hitman outright. The individual who provided him with the information about the hit and where it was going to go down would sooner die than take the stand to testify to what he knew. So Callie really had nothing to prove these guys were coming to the Walnut Room with the intentions of doing Early harm. The only way Agent Callie was going to be able to arrest them was if they actually did hurt Early. And obviously Callie wasn't going to allow that to occur either. He was walking a thin line here. As they sat in the bar waiting, Callie spotted 2 particularly large men casually stroll into the Walnut Room. He watched as they scanned the room, stopping when they spotted Early Dawson. They walked up to him as he sat at the bar, his hands wrapped around his beer. They told Early that they were acquaintances of his brother. Could they step outside? They wanted to talk. Remember, Early can't go outside. Agent Callie knew the hitmen were going to try to get Early out of the Walnut Room, so Early came up with the stalling tactic. How's about a game or 2 at pool? Surprisingly, the hitmen agree. I suppose they needed to play it cool, earn Early's trust, maybe get a few more beers in him. The hitmen themselves also had some beers, and they started shooting some pool with Early, the guy there that they were there to murder. Agent Callie walked up to the hitmen and told them that they needed to have some words. That every single person in the Walnut Room with them was an FBI agent, and every single one of them was armed. And even if they looked at any one of them sideways, they were going to find themselves either in jail forever or their brains were going to be splattered on this pool table right here. It was their choice. They technically hadn't done anything illegal yet, so all Agent Callie could do was tell them to leave. Go away, go far away, and don't come back around. The 2 hitmen left, and Early, just like Charlie, was placed into the witness protection program too. Early Dawson would go on to testify against 6 out of the 7 defendants, and they were each convicted. Emil, Charlie, and Phil were each sentenced to 20 years in prison. James and Ronnie were each sentenced to 15 years. By the beginning of 1973, just about half the loot stolen from United California Bank had been taken back. A couple of months later, they would come up with even more of it. Good old Harry Hall. Remember him? Part-time PR guy with the Los Angeles Teamsters? Part-time snitch? He went to a bank in Chicago and tried to secure himself a $300,000 loan. And what exactly did he have as collateral? About $175,000 worth of stolen securities. Stolen from one very large bank heist out of Laguna Niguel, California. Needless to say, Harry Hall did not get his loan, but he did get himself arrested and taken to trial for the stolen securities. And he had a story for the court and the jury. This was all a setup. He had been bamboozled by the Teamsters. He was given these securities by them. He's the unsuspecting middleman caught up in a much bigger plot. This money, these securities that came as a result of a failed attempt to steal funds from President Nixon's re-election campaign, ended up in the hands of the Teamsters, who had historically been known to endorse only Democratic candidates in the past, yet suddenly felt compelled 3 months after the burglary to go on record endorsing a Republican for the very first time, incumbent President Richard Nixon. So the jury decided that Harry Hall sounded legit. Despite his long criminal record, though they probably didn't know anything about it, he would end up being acquitted. And Nixon would win the election that year, though, as you know, he would end up resigning in the face of potential impeachment 2 years later in August of 1974. And with that, all the Laguna Niguel bank robbers were serving time. All of them except Harry Barber. So let's fast forward in time. It's August of 1977. In the town of Brookville, Pennsylvania, a place with a population of about 4,000. A straight shot up Interstate 80 east of Youngstown, Ohio. Marlene Brady was in mourning. A drunk driving incident would take her husband's life, leaving her a widow. She left the funeral with her sister, Darlene. Marlene and Darlene. Yeah, rhyming names. They're twins, if that helps any. Marlene needed a drink, so they stopped in at a local bar. The bartender there saw Marlene. It was obvious to him that she was going through something rough, so he approached their booth. He introduced himself. "My name's John. John Baker." This was a place the wanted criminal formerly known as Harry Barber would settle down. And Marlene was smitten. Before long, John and Marlene were an item, and John Baker was on top of the world. That pesky old bank robbery thing, he's more than 5 years removed from that mess. He's created himself a new life in the small mill town of Brookville. After a few nights out with Marlene, she became his girlfriend. He's got a pretty good job. The tips are decent. With Harry Barber dead, being John Baker is turning out to be everything he'd hoped for and then some. Life is good. But one day, when John walked into the local post office to send some mail or pick up some stamps, whatever he was there to do, he looked up at the wall and saw the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives poster hanging right there. And lo and behold, there's Harry Barber's mug. Without anyone looking, he tore the poster down off the wall and quickly left the post office. John Baker had a good reputation in town. He's friendly with the local law enforcement too. He even invited the town's deputy sheriff on a trip to Hawaii, which he accepted. They were there for a week. And while they were there in Hawaii, even though Harry is masquerading as John, he's still Harry to the core. He decided to have a little fun with the FBI. Maybe it was an attempt to throw them off, but whatever the case, it was bold, and he was essentially taunting them. He mailed a postcard to the Los Angeles FBI office, and on it he wrote, "Catch me if you can." Signed, Harry Barber. John Baker's not worried. Like I said, the local cops are his friends. His girlfriend's twin sister, Darlene, she's a deputy herself, and nobody had a bad thing to say about the guy. Even the chief of Brookville's police department hired John to do some work around his place. John had become the go-to guy for repairs around town. The senior center, the local shops, and ironically, even the bank. They trusted John so much they had even given him the keys to the bank so he can get in there on the weekends to do their remodel. He would say he had keys to half the town even. And John, he refused to be paid for his work. He lived with Marlene. He's taken in a stray cat and made it his pet. John Baker takes care of everything. It was his way of giving back to the community. Kind of like his Uncle Emil had once done. He wasn't robbing anymore. He wasn't about to mess up the good thing he had going there in Brookville, Pennsylvania. Every once in a while, though, John thinks about his old life, his past life. The life he killed off when he became John Baker. And when he does, he would get into his truck and make the jaunt up Interstate 80 across the border into Ohio and head for Youngstown. And with him, he had his out-on-the-town clothes. By 1980, John was confident that nobody was looking for him anymore. So he was comfortable showing back up at his old stomping grounds. And while in Youngstown, he would hook up with his old friends and they'd go to some of the local clubs and bars, all the hot night spots. And by Sunday, before he headed back to his quiet life in Brookville, he would drop his clothes off at the very same dry cleaner that his mom and dad used to go to when he was young. Once his cleaning was done, he packed up everything and would drive back home to his girlfriend and his cat. And then one evening, not too long after his last trip to Youngsville, John was in the kitchen having a bite to eat. Marlene was dutifully putting away his laundry, and as she was folding a pair of pants, she spotted some writing on the inside of the pocket of his pants. The dry cleaner had wrote it, and it read H. Barber. "Who's H. Barber?" she asked. John stayed quiet for a moment, and he finally came to the conclusion that he needed to come with the truth. Over the next several hours, he spilled the whole story, and Marlene just sat there intently listening and taking it all in. "You are Harry Barber? You robbed a bank of almost $9 million in California? You buried some of it there and the rest you hauled in a boat across the country? And you've been on the run ever since?" She stared at him for a moment, and when he finished, he couldn't figure out which direction she was going to go with what he had just told her. Until finally, and she admits this was the most awesome story she'd ever heard. She couldn't believe he had hidden all of this from her, but she wasn't mad. She was excited. So much so, she had to tell her twin sister, Darlene. Deputy Darlene. And Darlene tells another deputy, and he tells another one, and it gets told again and again and again. But as the word of the legend of John Baker is spreading through Brookville like wildfire, John/Harry has no idea that the gossip has made its rounds. Not until one day, while he was doing some electrical repairs at a local campground, when he received a tap on the shoulder. "Are you Harry Barber?" "Nope, never heard of him." The shoulder tapper already knew it was Harry. That shoulder tapper, as it turned out, was the FBI. Harry Barber had just been resurrected from the dead. A fugitive no more. John Baker can, for the second time, rest in peace once again. After 8 years on the run, Harry Barber was finally in custody. Marlene, she stopped in a couple times to see him while he was still in Pennsylvania awaiting extradition. But once he was sent to California, she would never see him again. Harry was tried, convicted, sentenced to 20 years, but would end up only serving 3. He ended up living in the city of Montclair, California, about an hour north of the bank that they robbed all those years earlier. The article about this story in the Orange County Register was from 2003. At the time, Harry was 61 years old, living in a small trailer, doing some odd jobs as a handyman. The last he heard, his uncles Emil and James were back in prison for more bank robberies that they had attempted to pull. He still expected his uncle to pony up the $500,000 he's owed from the Laguna Niguel job. And once he's out, he'll be good for it, so says Harry. If Harry ever got the money from his uncle Emil, I can't say for sure. Harry's story has been told in a movie loosely based on the bank heist released earlier this year entitled Finding Steve McQueen. As it's been said, that Harry had a fascination with the legendary actor. And that brings this 92nd episode of California Dreaming to a close. Thank you for your patience with this one. It's out a little bit late. The story was longer and more complicated than I initially thought. If you would like to read more about this case, the Register published a 10-part series 16 years ago, though I did go over much of what the series covered here with you, and then some. And I believe at least one of the bank robbers published a book about the case as well. If you would like to discuss this case in more detail or any others that we've covered, please feel free to request and join the California Dreaming Facebook discussion page. There, we have cultivated an amazing community of listeners and true crime fans who share their thoughts and opinions on all of our cases that we cover, as well as current true crime stories, other news events, TV shows that we enjoy, documentaries that we've watched, books that we've read. Whatever you find that you'd like to share, please come and join us. You can also follow the show on Twitter at CaliforniaPod and on Instagram at CaliforniaDreamingPod. And California Dreaming is proudly brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network. We are a podcast production company located in Los Angeles, California, with a mission to create some of the best podcasts out there to listen to consistently improve upon our current roster of shows, to develop new content that appeals to all people all over the world, and to provide a thriving community for listeners and podcasters alike. I am so proud to be a part of an amazing group of shows and talented hosts. So please visit us at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. You can find links to all of our shows, our merchandise store. There you can get your California Dreaming t-shirt or mug. Take a picture, post it in our group or on Instagram for everybody to see. Or if you just want to email us with your feedback, comments, questions, or to just let us know what you think. That's www.orbitaljigsaw.com. Thank you so much again for listening. I'm your host, Roseanne, and until next time, sweet dreams.